She stacked turf against her walls. Niels Bergstrom, who had survived 11 Dakota winters, told her plainly, "A widow cannot heat a cabin alone. Your children will be ice before Christmas." She had $14, 3 children under 7, and a cabin the wind cut through like paper. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature dropped 86 degrees in 14 hours. But 5 months earlier, Ragna Holm had never seen a Dakota winter in her life. She had seen Norwegian winters, the long dark of Telemark, the snow on the mountain pastures, the ice that sealed the fjords from November to April. But Norwegian winters came with stone houses built into hillsides, with neighbors a short walk through the valley, with generations of knowledge packed into every wall and roof and chimney. Dakota winters came with nothing but flat horizon and wind that could kill a strong man between his barn and his door. Ragna learned this in stages, each lesson worse than the last. The first lesson came in April of 1887, when the Holm family stepped off the train in Mitchell, Dakota Territory, and Ragna felt the wind for the first time. It was not cold. Spring had come early to the plains that year, but it was constant. It pressed against her like a hand on her chest. It never stopped. In Norway, wind came in gusts between the mountains. Here, it simply existed, a permanent feature of the world like gravity or time. Eric Holm had filed their homestead claim by mail from Iowa, sight unseen. 160 acres, 7 miles southwest of the town of Howard, in Minor County. The land office clerk in Mitchell gave them directions and a warning. "Get your cabin up before June," he said. "Summer's short, winter's long. You don't want to be living in a wagon when the snow comes." They bought lumber in Mitchell, $32 for enough green pine boards to build a 14 by 16-foot claim shanty, plus $8 for 2 small windows and a door. They loaded it onto their wagon and drove southwest across grass that stretched to the edge of the sky. The claim was good land. Ragna could see that even with her farmer's eye trained on Norwegian slopes instead of American plains, the soil was black and deep. A seasonal creek cut across the northwest corner. The grass grew thick and tall, taller than Anders, who was 6. But there was nothing else. No trees, no hills, no shelter of any kind, just grass and wind and sky, repeating forever in every direction. Their nearest neighbor lived 3.5 miles northeast, a family named Hendricks. Ragna would not meet them for 2 months. Eric built the cabin in 3 weeks. He was a good carpenter. He had built fishing boats in Telemark before the poverty drove them out, and he worked from first light until he could no longer see his hands. The walls went up board by board, single thickness, with tar paper nailed to the outside and rags stuffed into the gaps where the green wood didn't sit flush. There was no foundation. The cabin sat directly on packed earth. The roof was pine boards covered with more tar paper, sloped just enough to shed rain. When it was finished, Eric stood back and looked at what he had built. Ragna saw the doubt in his face. The walls were thin. The gaps were visible. A man could see daylight through the cracks if he pressed his eye to the right spot. "It will settle," Eric said. "The wood will swell when the rains come. The gaps will close." The gaps did not close. The wood dried in the summer heat and shrank. By August, the gaps were wider than they had been in May. Eric died on the 19th of August, 1887. He was breaking sod in the south field, turning the virgin prairie with a walking plow pulled by their ox, when the horse in the adjacent paddock spooked at something, a snake perhaps, or a shadow. The horse kicked backward. Eric was standing too close. The hoof caught him in the chest. Ragna found him in the field, still breathing. She dragged him to the cabin, 140 yards, his heels leaving furrows in the turned earth, and laid him on the bed. Anders watched from the doorway, holding Leiv's hand. Britta, who was 2, cried in her cradle. Eric died that night. His last words were in Norwegian, a prayer his mother had taught him, and then he was gone. Ragna buried him 200 yards from the cabin on a low rise where the grass grew shorter. She marked the grave with a wooden cross made from scrap lumber. She did not cry. There was no time to cry. The children needed to eat. The cow needed to be milked. The ox needed to be fed. The sun was setting and tomorrow was coming, and everything that had been Eric's responsibility was now hers. She counted her money that night after the children were asleep. $14.60 in paper currency. A few coins. Nothing else. In the morning, she began to calculate what it would take to survive. The mathematics of winter on the Dakota Plains were merciless, and Ragna learned them piece by piece over the following weeks. Fuel came first. A cabin like hers, single board walls, tar paper backing, gaps that let the wind whistle through, would need to burn hot and constant from November through March. 6 cords of firewood at minimum. 8 to be safe. There was no firewood. The nearest timber stood 40 miles east along the Big Sioux River. Cordwood shipped by rail cost $8 per cord in good times, $12 in winter, when demand peaked and supply froze. 8 cords at $8? $64. She had 14. The alternative fuels were worse. Cow chips, dried cattle dung, burned at 1/3 the heat of wood. A family would need a pile 10 feet high to last the winter on chips alone. Ragna had 2 cows. Their combined output, even if she collected every chip from spring through fall, would heat the cabin for perhaps 6 weeks. Twisted hay was the other option. Cats, the settlers called them, braids of prairie grass twisted tight and fed to the stove like sticks. They burned fast and hot and required constant attention. Laura Ingalls Wilder, who survived the hard winter of 1880 to 81,200 miles to the north, would later write of spending entire days doing nothing but twisting hay to keep the fire alive. Then there was the cabin itself. Ragna understood, in a way that Eric perhaps had not, that the problem was not merely fuel. The problem was that her cabin could not hold heat. She pressed her hand against the east wall one evening in early September. The outside temperature was 60 degrees. The inside temperature, by the rough judgment of her skin, was perhaps 65. 5 degrees of difference. The thin boards and tar paper were doing almost nothing. In January, when the outside temperature dropped to 20 below zero and the wind blew at 40 miles per hour, that 5-degree difference would mean an interior temperature of 15 below. No fire could overcome that. The heat would escape through the walls faster than any stove could produce it. She would burn her entire fuel supply in a month and still freeze. The numbers did not work, no matter how Ragna arranged them, no matter how she rationed and calculated and hoped. The numbers did not work. Niels Bergstrom came to the claim in the second week of September. He was a big man, Swedish by birth but Norwegian by upbringing, with a gray beard and hands like shovels. He had homesteaded 12 miles north since 1876. 11 Dakota winters survived. 2 neighbors buried, one in the hard winter, one in the big die-up of 86 to 87. Bergstrom did not introduce himself. He simply rode up to the cabin, dismounted, and began walking around it, examining the walls the way a doctor examines a sick patient. Ragna came out of the cabin with Britta on her hip and found him pressing his finger into one of the gaps between boards. "This your husband's work?" Bergstrom asked. "He is dead," Ragna said. Bergstrom nodded slowly, as if death were simply another fact about the cabin, like the thin walls or the tar paper roof. "When?" "August. You're staying?" "Yes." Bergstrom walked the perimeter of the cabin one more time. He looked at the 2 cows in their pen. He looked at the ox. He looked at the children, Anders standing in the doorway, Liv hiding behind him, Britta squirming in Ragna's arms. "You have money?" he asked. $14. Lumber costs 50, 60 to double these walls. More for the labor. I know. Fuel costs 60, 70 for the winter. More if it's a hard one. I know. Bergstrom stood very still for a moment, his eyes on the cabin. Then he turned to face Ragna directly. "A widow cannot heat a cabin alone," he said. "Not with walls like these. Not with 3 children to feed and no timber within 40 miles and no money for coal. Your children will be ice before Christmas." Ragna did not answer. "I have seen what happens," Bergstrom continued. "I have cut frozen bodies out of cabins with an axe because the doors were iced shut and the walls were too cold to touch. I have seen children stacked like cordwood in the snow because their parents could not dig graves in frozen ground. You do not want your children to see their mother's frozen face." "What would you have me do?" Ragna asked. "Go to Howard. Find a family to take you in. Or go back to Iowa, back to wherever your people are. There is no shame in knowing when you are beaten." Ragna looked at the cabin. She looked at the grave marker on the low rise, 200 yards distant. She looked at her children. "I am not beaten," she said. Bergstrom shook his head. "Every one of them says that. Then the cold comes, and the fuel runs out, and the prayers stop working, and in the spring we find them." He mounted his horse and rode north without looking back. The dugout changed everything. Ragna found it in mid-September, a quarter-mile behind a low rise she had never bothered to explore. Some previous homesteader, a failed claim, an abandoned dream, had carved a shelter into the south face of a small hill. The roof had partially collapsed. Prairie grass was reclaiming the entrance, but the walls were still there, packed earth reaching back into the hillside like a cave. Ragna stepped inside. The air was different. Outside, the September afternoon was warm, 62 degrees by the feel of it, with a light breeze from the northwest. Inside the dugout, the temperature felt cooler, but when Ragna pressed her palm against the earthen wall, she felt something unexpected. The earth was warm, not hot, not cold. Warm. Warmer than the air around her. Warmer than it had any right to be. Ragna stood very still, her hand against the packed dirt, and remembered. She remembered her grandmother's house in Telemark, built into the side of a mountain with turf piled thick on every wall. She remembered the root cellar behind her father's farm, dug deep into the hillside, where vegetables stayed unfrozen through the coldest winters. She remembered the old stories, the stabur and the yord stew, the earth houses and the turf huts where her ancestors had survived winters that killed everything they could not protect. The earth held heat. The earth blocked wind. Everyone on the Dakota plains knew this. It was why sod houses stayed warm when timber cabins froze, but sod houses took weeks to build and required a breaking plow to cut the blocks. Ragna had a spade. She did not have weeks. She stood in the dugout for a long time, thinking, what if she did not build a sod house? What if she built a sod wall around the house she already had? The logic assembled itself in her mind like pieces of a puzzle finding their places. Her cabin's problem was not the wood. Logs provided decent insulation. She knew this from Norway, where timber houses stood for centuries. Her cabin's problem was the gaps. The wind blew through the gaps. The wind carried the heat away. The cabin could not hold warmth because it could not stop wind. Earth would stop wind. A wall of sod blocks cut from the prairie, stacked against the cabin's exterior, would seal every gap more thoroughly than any rag or mud plaster. And earth did not just stop wind, earth held temperature. The dugout proved it. The root cellars of Norway proved it. packed earth changed slowly, resisting heat and cold alike, holding whatever temperature it had absorbed. If she bermed the cabin, buried the walls under 3 feet of sod, the wind would hit the earth and stop. The heat inside would hit the earth and slow. The cabin would become, in effect, a small wooden box inside a much larger earthen shell. It might work. It might not. Ragna walked home with the idea burning in her mind and did the calculations that night by candlelight. 3 walls needed berming north, east, west. The south wall, with its door and windows, would have to stay exposed. Each wall was either 14 or 16 feet long. She wanted the berm 5 feet high enough to cover the bottom of the windows. 2 blocks deep at the base, tapering to 1 block at the top. 660 blocks. Give or take. Each block would weigh 50 pounds. 33,000 pounds of sod, total. More than 16 tons. Cut with a spade, by hand, by one woman, stacked by that same woman, block by block, course by course, in 6 weeks. Ragna set down her pencil. She looked at her hands, soft, still, from the relatively easy work of summer. She looked at the children sleeping in the single bed against the wall. In the morning, she began. Martha Hendricks came by in late September, 3 days after Ragna started cutting sod. Martha was 42 years old, the mother of 5 children, one of whom she had buried in the Dakota earth 2 years prior. She was practical, experienced, and kind in the blunt way of women who had seen too much to waste time on gentle words. She had heard from a passing traveler that the Norwegian widow on the home claim was doing something strange. She found Ragna behind the cabin, ankle deep in torn prairie, cutting sod blocks with her late husband's breaking spade. The work was brutal. Each block required 6 cuts, 2 lengthwise, 2 widthwise, 2 underneath to free it from the earth, and then had to be lifted, carried, and set aside. Ragna's shoulders ached, her back screamed. Her hands, which had been blistered for 2 days, were now bleeding openly. Anders and Liv sat nearby, watching Britta play in the turned earth. Martha did not dismount from her wagon. She sat and watched Ragna work for a long minute. "What are you doing?" she finally asked. Ragna straightened, pressing one hand to the small of her back. "Cutting sod." "I can see that. What for?" "For the walls." Ragna gestured toward the cabin. "I'm going to stack them against the walls, to hold the heat in." Martha was silent. "Like a dugout," Ragna continued, "or like the turf houses in Norway. The earth blocks the wind and holds the warmth. If I can berm 3 walls—" "You are going to bury your cabin," Martha said. "Yes." Martha climbed down from the wagon. She walked to the cabin and looked at it, the thin boards, the tar paper, the gaps that let daylight through. She looked at the small pile of sod blocks Ragna had already cut, perhaps 40 of them, stacked neatly in rows. "Sod houses work because they are built thick from the ground up," Martha said. "Proper walls, proper weight distribution. The sod supports itself. You cannot just pile dirt against boards." "Why not?" "The weight will push the walls in. The boards will rot where the earth touches them. You will have a pile of mud and a collapsed cabin and 3 dead children." Ragna wiped sweat from her forehead, leaving a streak of dirt across her skin. "The weight will push inward, yes. But the roof beams will hold. I have checked them. They are solid. And the boards may rot in time, but I do not need them to last 10 years. I need them to last 1 winter." Martha shook her head. "If you are going to stay, buy lumber. Double the walls the proper way." "With what money?" Martha had no answer. "I do not have $50 for lumber," Ragna said. "I have grass. I have a spade. I have 6 weeks before the ground freezes. That is what I have, so that is what I will use." You will bury yourself and those children. Rasana picked up the spade and turned back to the uncut prairie. Perhaps, but if I do nothing, we will certainly freeze. At least this way there is a chance. Martha watched for another long moment. Then she climbed back onto her wagon. I will come by in November, she said, to see if you are still alive. She drove away without looking back. Ragna cut 18 more blocks before dark. Word spread. In a country where neighbors lived miles apart and news traveled at the speed of horses, word still spread. By October, the general store in Howard had heard about the crazy Norwegian widow who was burying her cabin in dirt. The Methodist minister mentioned it in his Sunday sermon, obliquely, as an example of the desperation that could grip those who had lost their way. Amos Cutter, who ran the land office and collected commissions on failed claims, made a note in his ledger. Cutter visited the Holm claim on the 3rd of October. He was a thin man with pale eyes and a smile that never quite reached them. He wore a town suit and city shoes that sank into the turned earth when he dismounted from his horse. He found Ragna stacking sod blocks against the north wall of the cabin, already 3 feet high, 300 blocks cut, carried, and placed over the past 3 weeks. Mrs. Holm, he said. Ragna did not stop working. Mr. Cutter, I am here to confirm that improvements are proceeding as required under the homestead regulations. They are proceeding. Cutter walked around the cabin, examining the berming with the expression of a man observing something distasteful. The north wall was nearly complete. The west wall had begun. The sod was packed tight against the boards, 2 blocks deep, stacked grass side down. The seams staggered like brickwork. This is not what the assessors typically recognize as improvement, Cutter said. Ragna continued stacking. In fact, Cutter continued, some might argue that you are damaging a perfectly functional structure, burying it, rendering it unsuitable for resale. Ragna set down a block and turned to face him. Is there a law against sod banking a cabin? Not as such. Then I will continue. Cutter's smile thinned. He glanced at the children, Anders standing watchful by the cabin door, Liv hiding behind him, Britta playing in the dirt. I am trying to help you, Mrs. Holm. A woman in your position, alone, limited resources, young children, you must think practically. The winter here is not like Norway. The winter here kills people. Strong people, prepared people, people with money and fuel and thick walls. He paused. People much better equipped than you. Ragna said nothing. I know a gentleman in Sioux Falls, Cutter continued. He's looking for farmland, improved claims. He would offer you a fair price for your homestead, enough to return to Iowa or wherever your family is. Your children would be safe. They would be warm. They would be alive come spring. What would he offer? Cutter pretended to calculate. $40, plus the livestock. The claim was worth $200 in improvements alone. The land itself, once proved up, would be worth 10 times that. No, Ragna said. Cutter's smile vanished. Think carefully. This is a generous offer. If you fail, and you will fail, you will lose the claim anyway. You will have nothing. Your children will be sent to the poorhouse in Sioux Falls, or the orphanage in Yankton, or they will be dead in the ground beside their father, and you will have only yourself to blame. Ragna picked up another sod block, 50 pounds of earth and grass, solid in her hands. Get off my land, she said. Cutter stared at her for a long moment. Then he mounted his horse and rode east toward Howard. He did not look back. After Cutter's visit, the isolation deepened. Martha Hendricks, who had visited twice since her first encounter with the Berming Project, stopped coming. When Ragna walked to Howard for supplies, people nodded politely but did not stop to talk. The general store owner, who had previously offered small kindnesses, an extra scoop of flour, a bit of salt pork that had fallen off the scale, became strictly businesslike. The Methodist minister suggested gently that the children might benefit from placement with a proper Christian family in town. Ragna was not being shunned. The frontier was too practical for pure malice, but she was being marked, measured, watched. If she succeeded, fine. If she failed when she failed, in most minds, no one wanted to be remembered as having encouraged the foolishness. The isolation made everything harder. When Britta developed a fever in mid-October, Ragna had no one to ask for advice. When the ox broke through a fence and wandered half a mile before she found him, there was no neighbor to help drive him back. When her spade handle cracked during the first hard freeze of the season, she had to walk 7 miles to Howard and 7 miles back to buy a new one, leaving the children alone for nearly a full day. But the work continued. October became November. The sod pile grew. The walls rose. Ragna's hands, which had bled and blistered and bled again, finally hardened into leather. Her shoulders, which had burned and ached and screamed, finally accepted the weight of 50-pound blocks as normal. Her back, which had threatened to give out a dozen times, somehow held. She cut 40 blocks a day, then 50, then 60, racing the freeze. Anders helped where he could. He was 6, too small to lift a full sod block, but strong enough to carry half blocks that Ragna trimmed for him. He stacked them at the base of the walls where they didn't need to be lifted high. Liv, at 4, tried to help, but mostly got in the way. Ragna let her carry water and feel useful. By the first week of November, the berming was nearly complete. North wall, done, 5 feet high, 3 feet thick at the base. West wall, done. East wall, 4 feet high, 1 more foot to go. Then the temperature dropped to 8 below zero. The ground froze solid. Ragna's spade bounced off the prairie like she was trying to cut stone. The remaining sod blocks, perhaps 50 more to finish the east wall, could not be cut. She stood in the field with frost forming on her eyelashes and accepted that she had run out of time. But that was not the worst discovery. When Ragna went inside that night, she felt it immediately. A draft. Cold air was seeping through the junction between the sod blocks, flowing through the seams, finding its way through the gaps in the stacked earth, and into the cabin. The berming blocked wind. But it did not stop air from finding paths through unsealed joints. 2 days. That was what Ragna had. The temperature would not warm enough to work the earth for at least that long, but it was still above zero, barely workable. If she could seal the seams before the real cold came, the system might hold. If she could not, the berming would be useless. A wall of gaps. Ragna worked through the night. She chipped frozen mud from the creek bed, not yet solid ice, just stiff enough to hold together. She mixed it with dried grass and pressed it into every gap she could find, working by lantern light, her fingers going numb, her breath freezing in clouds before her face. By dawn of the second day, her hands had stopped working. She could not close them into fists. She could not feel the mud she was packing into the seams. Anders found her kneeling against the east wall, hands buried in a pile of mud and grass, unable to move. He brought her inside. He wrapped her hands in rags and held them near the stove. Feeling returned slowly, painfully, with a particular agony of flesh warming from near frozen. Ragna slept for 2 hours. Then she went back outside. By evening of the third day, the seams were sealed. The gaps were packed. The temperature had dropped to 14 below zero, and when Ragna walked around the cabin and pressed her ear to each bermed wall, she heard nothing. No wind, no whistle, no draft. The earth held. 3 days later, a wagon appeared on the road from Howard. Ragna did not recognize it at first. She was clearing snow from the south-facing windows. 3 inches had fallen overnight, and the cold had made her slow and stupid. When she finally looked up, she saw an old man climbing down from the wagon seat, moving with the careful stiffness of someone whose joints had survived too many winters. Ole Anderson. She had heard of him, but never met him. A Norwegian bachelor farmer, 62 years old, who lived 15 miles north and traded in Howard once a month. He had come to Dakota in 1879 and survived the hard winter alone, in a sod dugout he had carved into a hillside with his own hands. He had heard about the widow who was burying her cabin. Anderson did not speak. He walked around the cabin, examining the berming the way Bergstrom had examined the walls months before, but his expression was different. Where Bergstrom had looked for flaws, Anderson seemed to be looking for something else. He pressed his hand against the packed sod. He bent down and examined the sealed seams. He stood at the corner where the bermed east wall met the exposed south wall, and studied how Ragna had angled the sod to shed water and snow. Finally, he turned and looked at her. "You did this yourself," he said. His accent was thick, telemark, like hers. "Yes?" Anderson was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something she did not expect. "Jord stew," he said. "In Telemark, we called it Jord stew, earth house. My grandmother's house was built into a hill. 3 walls were dirt. 1 wall was wood for the door and the window. It never froze, not even in the worst winters." Ragna felt something shift in her chest. Not relief, not yet, but something close. Anderson walked back to his wagon and pulled out 2 items, a burlap sack that clinked when he set it down, a small bundle wrapped in cloth. 60 pounds of dried corn, he said, gesturing to the sack, and $5. He set the bundle on top. Ragna started to refuse. Pride surged up in her throat. She had not asked for charity, had not wanted it, had survived this long on her own. Anderson held up his hand. "I am an old man," he said. "I have no children. I have more corn than I can eat and more money than I need. Take it as payment." "Payment for what?" Anderson looked at the bermed cabin. He looked at Ragna's hands, cracked and rough, the hands of someone who had moved 16 tons of earth in 6 weeks. "For showing me something I had forgotten," he said. "Everyone here builds the American way. Thin boards, lots of fire. They build fast and cheap, and they burn fuel all winter trying to stay alive. Back home, we built the old way. Thick walls, less fire. We built slow and solid, and we trusted the earth to do what the earth has always done." He paused. "You remembered what we forgot. That is worth more than corn." He climbed back onto his wagon, turned the horses north, and drove away. Ragna counted her resources that night. Money, $16. Food, supplies extended to late February with Anderson's corn. Fuel, cow chips for perhaps 6 weeks. Corn cobs from Anderson's gift for another week. Twisted hay for as long as she could stand to twist it. Cabin, 3 walls bermed to 5 feet. Seam sealed. South wall exposed but sheltered by the earth on either side. Still needed more fuel to survive January and February. The math was still short, but it was closer. The berming was supposed to reduce fuel consumption. She had calculated 40%, maybe 50%, based on how the dugout had felt compared to the open air. If those calculations held, her fuel might stretch. If. December came. The temperatures dropped, 10 above 0, then 0, then 10 below, then 20. Ragna kept a small fire burning in the cast iron stove and watched. The bermed walls stayed warm. Not warm like summer, but warm compared to the south wall, which frosted over on the inside during cold snaps. The cabin held temperature longer after she banked the fire at night. The fuel pile cow chips stacked against the south wall, under a tarp, depleted slower than expected. Martha Hendricks visited in mid-December, her first time at the claim in almost 2 months. She brought a jar of preserved plums as a gift and something else in her expression. Not quite apology, not quite admission, but something close. "The cabin looks solid," she said. "It is holding," Ragnar replied. Martha nodded slowly. Then she said, "December is not January. Wait until the real cold comes. Then we will see." The real cold had not come. The first week of January brought blizzards, 3 of them, one after another, with temperatures that dropped to 30 below. Ragnar's fuel dwindled. She burned the corn cobs from Anderson's gift. She twisted hay until her arms ached and her fingers cracked. The children huddled near the stove, wrapped in every blanket they owned, but the cabin held. The interior temperature stayed above freezing. The bermed walls did not shake in the wind. On January 11th, the weather broke. Ragnar woke to warmth. Not warmth by any reasonable standard. The inside of the cabin was perhaps 40 degrees, but warmth compared to the brutal cold of the previous week. She opened the door and felt air that was almost balmy. 38 degrees by mid-morning, 40 by noon. The sky was clear. The sun was bright. Ice was melting off the windows. Snow was softening to slush in the yard. Ragnar let the fire die to embers and stepped outside without her coat. For the first time in weeks, she could breathe without pain. Anders and Liv played in the muddy yard. Britta toddled after them, laughing at the strange sensation of ground that was not frozen solid. The cows, let out of their cramped shed, wandered toward the creek bed to drink from the trickle of snowmelt. It felt like a gift, a reprieve. The winter saying, "Not yet. You have a little longer." Ragnar decided to walk to the Hendricks place. 3.5 miles. She could be there and back before dark, with hours to spare. The children needed company. She needed news, and she had preserved vegetables to trade for flour. At 10 o'clock in the morning on January 12th, 1888, Ragnar Holm gathered her 3 children and set out on foot across the melting snow. Anders walked. Liv walked. Ragnar carried Britta. They had traveled approximately 1 mile when Ragnar looked up and saw the sky to the northwest. It was not gray. It was not white. It was black. A wall of black so absolute it looked like the world ended there, like everything beyond that line had simply ceased to exist. And it was moving toward them faster than a horse could run. The storm hit like a physical blow. One moment Ragnar was standing in weak January sunlight, watching a black wall advance across the horizon. The next moment, she was blind. The temperature dropped so fast she felt it in her lungs before she felt it on her skin. The air went from 38 degrees to 20 degrees to 0 in what felt like seconds. Later, meteorologists would calculate that the front subtracted 18 degrees in 3 minutes. In the moment, it felt like stepping from summer into a meat locker. The wind came with the cold. 60 miles per hour, driving snow that was not snow but ice, crystals fine as flour and sharp as needles, scouring exposed skin like sandpaper. Ragnar's eyes froze shut. She pried them open with her fingers and immediately lost sight of her own hand. Visibility had dropped to nothing, absolute nothing. White in every direction, not white like snow, but white like the inside of a cloud, like being wrapped in a sheet, like the world had simply erased itself and left only wind and cold and screaming. The children were screaming. Ragnar could not see them. She could not see anything, but she could hear Anders shouting and Liv crying and Britta. Britta was in her arms, pressed against her chest, and the child's screams were muffled by Ragnar's coat, but still audible, still real, still alive. Anders, Ragnar shouted. Her voice vanished into the wind. Anders, take my hand. A small hand found hers, cold, gloveless. Anders had been playing in the mud. He had taken his mittens off to build something and not put them back on. Liv, Ragnar shouted. Liv, where are you? Nothing. Wind and white and nothing. Ragnar pulled Anders close and began to move, shuffling in a direction she hoped was the right one, reaching with her free hand into the blankness. Liv. A sob. Somewhere to her left. Ragnar lunged toward it and caught fabric, Liv's coat. The child crouched in the snow, hands over her face, crying. I have you, Ragnar said. I have you. Hold on to Anders. Do not let go. Do not let go for anything. She had rope. She always carried rope, a habit from Norway, where mountain families rope together in whiteout conditions. 30 feet of hemp cord coiled in her coat pocket. She tied one end around her own waist, looped it through Anders's belt, and knotted it to Liv's coat. We're going home, she said. We walk together. We do not stop. If you fall, you stand up. If you cannot stand, you crawl. We do not stop until we are home. Home was 1 mile away, 1 mile through zero visibility with 60-mile-per-hour wind and 3 children, one of whom she was carrying, 2 of whom could barely stand upright. Ragnar had no compass. She had no landmarks. Everything had vanished. She had only the wind. The wind came from the northwest. She had noted that in the moment before blindness took her. If she kept the wind on her right cheek, slightly behind her right ear, she would be walking roughly south, roughly toward the cabin. Roughly was not the same as accurately. Roughly across a mile of featureless prairie and zero visibility could mean missing the cabin by 100 yards. 100 yards might as well be 100 miles. She began to walk. Time stopped meaning anything. Ragnar walked and the children walked, and the wind screamed and the cold bit deeper with every step. She could not feel her face. She could not feel her hands. She could feel Britta against her chest. The child had stopped crying, which was worse than crying, which might mean warmth or might mean something terrible, and she could feel the rope tugging at her waist as the children stumbled behind her. They fell. They fell constantly. The snow was already drifting, piling into ridges and hollows that caught their feet and sent them sprawling. Each time Anders fell, the rope jerked at Ragnar's waist. Each time Liv fell, Anders fell with her. They would lie in the snow for seconds that felt like hours, and Ragnar would scream at them to get up, and they would get up, and they would keep walking. She lost the wind once. Somehow, in the chaos of a particularly bad fall, she got turned around. The wind was on her left cheek instead of her right. She'd been walking east, toward nothing, toward open prairie, toward death. She corrected, turned until the wind was right again. Kept walking. How long? She did not know. Later, she would estimate 2 hours. In the moment, it felt like forever. It felt like she'd always been walking through this white hell, and always would be, that this was existence now. This was reality. This cold, blind, stumbling march toward a home that might not exist anymore. Her foot hit something solid, not snow, not grass, something solid and vertical and cold. She reached out with her free hand and touched packed earth, the bermed, the north wall of her cabin. She had walked into the sod. Finding the door took another 10 minutes. The cabin was completely invisible, buried in white, indistinguishable from the drifts piling against it. Ragnar kept one hand on the bermed wall and walked along it, feeling for the corner, then the next corner, then the exposed south wall, Then finally, the door. It would not open. Snow had drifted against it, packed by the wind into something almost solid. Ragna kicked at it, pounded at it, screamed at it. The children huddled against her, all three of them now, pressing into her body heat. The door gave. 6 inches. Enough. Ragna shoved Anders through the gap, shoved Liv after him, squeezed through herself with Britta still clutched to her chest. The cabin was dark. The fire was out. She had let it die to embers that morning, a decision that now seemed like insanity. The interior temperature was perhaps 35 degrees. Cold, but not killing cold. Ragna slammed the door behind her and stood in the darkness, breathing. Outside, the wind howled. The walls shook. The south wall, the exposed wall, shuddered with each gust. But the bermed walls were silent. The packed earth absorbed the wind's fury and gave nothing back. "Matches," Ragna said. Her voice sounded strange in her own ears. "Anders, on the shelf. Get the matches." The boy moved in the darkness. Ragna heard him climbing onto the stool, feeling along the shelf. A moment later, a match flared. By its light, Ragna saw her children. Anders was white, not pale, white. His face was covered in frost, his eyebrows frozen solid, his lips blue. His ungloving hands were waxy and stiff. Liv was the same, frost in her hair, tears frozen on her cheeks. Britta was not crying. Britta was limp against Ragna's chest, her eyes half closed, her breathing shallow. Ragna laid the child on the bed and stripped off her coat, her dress, her underclothes. She needed to see. She needed to know. Britta's left foot was bare. The boot was gone. Somewhere in the walk home, in one of the falls, in the chaos of the wind, the child's boot had come off, and Ragna, blinded and deafened and focused on nothing but forward motion, had not noticed. The foot was white, not pale white, dead white, the white of frozen meat. Ragna touched it and felt nothing. No warmth, no give. The flesh was hard as wood. The fire first. Nothing else mattered if the fire would not catch. Ragna's hands were shaking, whether from cold or fear or both, she could not tell. She fed kindling into the stove, twisted hay, corn cobs, a precious piece of actual wood that she had been saving. She struck match after match until one caught, until the kindling caught, until flames licked up and she could close the stove door and know that heat was coming. Then Britta. Ragna knew frostbite. She had seen it in Norway. Men who had stayed too long in the mountain pastures, women who had fallen through ice. She knew that frozen flesh must be warmed slowly. Hot water would damage the tissue further. Heat too fast, and the thawing flesh would die. She filled a basin with water from the bucket by the door. The water was cold, above freezing, but barely. She added a little from the kettle that had been sitting on the cold stove, warming it to just above body temperature. She immersed Britta's foot. The child screamed. It was the first sound Britta had made since they entered the cabin, and it was not crying or whimpering, but screaming, a high, sharp, terrible sound that went on as the nerves in her frozen flesh began to wake up. Ragna held the foot in the water, and Britta screamed, and Anders and Liv huddled in the corner with their hands over their ears, and the wind howled outside, and the fire crackled, and the cabin held. The foot changed color, white to gray, gray to red, red to purple. Purple was good. Purple meant blood was flowing. Purple meant the flesh might live. Britta stopped screaming. The child's eyes rolled back and she fainted, her small body going limp on the bed. Ragna kept the foot in the water. She added warmer water as the basin cooled, raising the temperature gradually, degree by degree, as the textbooks she had never read would have recommended. 30 minutes, An hour. The foot was still purple, still swollen, but it was no longer white. It was no longer frozen. When Ragna pressed her finger against the sole, she felt give. Living flesh. Damaged, possibly permanently, but living. She wrapped the foot in clean rags, covered Britta with every blanket in the cabin, and turned to the other children. Anders's hands were frostbitten, not as severely as Britta's foot, but the fingers were white and stiff. Ragna warmed them the same way, slowly, in tepid water. The boy did not scream. He gritted his teeth and cried silently, tears freezing on his cheeks before she could wipe them away. Leave's face was frost-nipped, the milder form, painful but not dangerous. Ragna warmed it with her own hands, cupping her daughter's cheeks until the color returned. By the time all three children were treated, the cabin interior had reached 50 degrees. Outside, according to the sounds that filtered through the walls, the storm had not relented at all. Ragna checked the stove, fed it more fuel, checked the children, fed them warm water with a little sugar dissolved in it. Then she sat down on the floor with her back against the bermed north wall and began to shake. The storm raged through the night. Ragna did not sleep. She could not. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the white wall bearing down. Every time she started to drift off, the wind would shriek and she would jerk awake, certain that the walls were collapsing, certain that the cold was coming through. But the walls did not collapse. The cold did not come through. The bermed walls held. Ragna fed the fire every hour, small amounts, just enough to maintain temperature. She checked Britta's foot every 30 minutes, looking for signs of gangrene, the blackening that would mean amputation. She listened to the wind and tried to calculate how much fuel she had left and how long the storm might last. At some point in the deep middle of the night, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, she had no way to know. She pressed her hand against the north wall. The packed earth was cold, but it was not frozen. It was not the killing cold of the air outside. She moved to the south wall, the exposed wall, and pressed her hand there. Ice. A thin sheet of frost had formed on the interior surface. The cold was pushing through the boards, through the tar paper, into the cabin, but only there. Only on the one wall she had not bermed. The arithmetic assembled itself in Ragna's exhausted mind. 3 walls protected, 1 wall exposed. If all 4 walls had been exposed, if she had faced this storm in an unbermed cabin, the frost would be on every surface. The cold would be coming from every direction. The fire would be fighting against 4 walls of loss instead of 1. She would be losing. She fed the stove and did not lose. At some point near dawn, when the wind had dropped just slightly and the darkness outside had begun to gray toward light, Ragna heard something through the wall. A sound that was not wind, a sound that was not snow, a voice, far away, barely audible, calling something. Then nothing, then silence. Ragna stood by the door and listened. The voice did not come again. In the morning, when the storm finally broke and the temperature climbed from 40 below to merely 20 below, she would learn what had happened across Minor County. She would learn about the Hendricks family, how they had burned their furniture, their floorboards, every piece of wood in their cabin trying to stay alive. How Martha's youngest boy had lost 3 toes, how the family would abandon their claim before spring, broken by 1 night of cold. She would learn about the Jensens 12 miles north, a family of 5, parents and 3 children, ages 8, 5, and 2. Their cabin had been found with the door frozen shut, a thin layer of ice on every interior surface. The stove was cold. The wood box was empty. They had burned everything, and it had not been enough. All 5 had frozen to death sitting upright around the cold stove. She would learn that 235 people died across the northern plains that night, that most of them were children, that the bodies of 5 boys from Freeman, South Dakota, were found 4 days later, huddled together in a snowdrift, a quarter-mile from safety. She would learn that the temperature had dropped to 42 below zero at the closest weather station, that the wind had held at 60 miles per hour for 18 hours, that the wind chill, a measurement no one had calculated yet, had exceeded 80 degrees below zero. But in that moment before dawn, standing by the door of her bermed cabin with her 3 children alive behind her, Ragna knew none of this. She knew only that the voice in the storm had fallen silent. She knew only that her cabin had held. The morning of January 13th, 1888, dawned clear and brutal. The temperature was 20 below zero when Ragna opened the south-facing door onto a transformed world. Snow had drifted to the eaves of the cabin. The berming on the north wall was completely buried, invisible beneath white. The landscape that had been brown grass and melting slush 24 hours earlier was now a smooth white plain stretching to every horizon. The cows were alive. They had sheltered against the south wall of their shed, pressed together for warmth, and somehow survived. One would die 3 days later from complications Ragna did not understand, but in that moment both were standing, both were breathing. The ox was alive. The children were alive. Britta's foot was still purple, still swollen, still painful when touched. But it was not black. There was no gangrene. The flesh was healing. Anders's fingers had recovered faster, red and painful, but functional. Within a week, he would have full feeling back. Within a month, the damage would be invisible. Ragna stood in her doorway and looked at the cabin she had spent 6 weeks burying. The sod was hidden under snow, but she knew it was there. 3 feet of packed earth on 3 walls. 16 tons of prairie grass and dirt, cut and carried and stacked by hand. It had held. Niels Bergstrom came to the home claim 1 week after the blizzard. He looked older than Ragna remembered. The hard cold had aged him, or perhaps it was something else, the weight of what he had seen, the bodies he had helped recover, the neighbors he had known for a decade who were now frozen meat waiting for spring burials. He dismounted from his horse and walked around Ragna's cabin without speaking. The snow had been cleared from the south wall. The berming was visible again, gray-brown against the white. Ragna came out to meet him. "I heard you walked through it," Bergstrom said. "With the children?" "Yes." "From a mile out?" "Yes." Bergstrom was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The Jensens are dead, all 5, froze in their cabin when the fire could not keep up with the cold." Ragna did not respond. There was nothing to say. "I knew them for 9 years," Bergstrom continued. "Good people, hard workers. Their cabin was solid, better than most. Thick logs, well chinked." He paused. It was not enough. He walked to the north wall and pressed his hand against the packed sod, just as Ole Anderson had done 3 months earlier. "I told you your children would be ice before Christmas," he said. "I told you a widow could not heat a cabin alone. I told you to leave." "You did." Bergstrom turned to face her. His eyes were red-rimmed, whether from cold or grief or sleeplessness, she could not tell. "I was wrong," he said. "The earthwork saved them. This," he gestured at the berming, "this is why you are alive and the Jensens are dead. This is why your children are inside that cabin breathing, instead of stacked in the snow waiting for the ground to thaw." Ragna said nothing. "I have survived 11 winters," Bergstrom said. "I thought I knew what survival looked like. I thought it looked like thick walls and big fires, and enough fuel to burn from November to March." He shook his head slowly. "I was wrong. Survival looks like this, like dirt piled against boards by a woman who remembered what the rest of us forgot. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small package, dried meat, wrapped in cloth. "Payment," he said, "for the lesson. I did not teach you anything. You taught me that an old man can be a fool even after 11 winters. That is worth more than meat." He climbed onto his horse. "I owe you an apology," he said, "and I owe those children thanks for having a mother smarter than I ever was." He rode north. Ragna watched him go. Martha Hendricks came in late January. She was thin, thinner than Ragna remembered. The blizzard had broken something in her. Her youngest boy walked with a limp now, 3 toes lost to the cold. Her husband had not spoken more than a few words since the morning after the storm. They had burned everything, the furniture, the floorboards, the bed frame. They had nothing left. "We are leaving," Martha said. "Going back to Illinois. My husband's brother has a farm. We cannot stay here." Ragna nodded. She understood. Martha looked at the cabin, looked at the burming, looked at the children playing in the yard, Anders throwing snowballs at Liv, Britta sitting on the steps watching them, her bandaged foot propped on a cushion. "You were right," Martha said. "I was wrong. The dirt saved you." "I am sorry about your boy." Martha's face tightened. "He will live. That is more than some can say." She stood very still for a moment. Then, "Before we go, I'm telling everyone who will listen, the Norwegian widow survived because she buried her cabin in sod. It sounds crazy. It worked. If anyone asks me how to stay alive in this godforsaken place, I'll tell them, do what the Holm woman did." She climbed back onto her wagon. "Thank you," she said, "for showing us what we should have seen ourselves." She drove away. Ragna did not see her again. By spring of 1888, word had spread. The Norwegian widow and her buried house became a topic of conversation at every gathering in Minor County. Some dismissed it as luck. Some dismissed it as exaggeration. But others, particularly those who had seen the inside of an unburned cabin during the blizzard, who had felt the cold pushing through every wall, asked questions. Ragna answered them all. She showed anyone who wanted to learn. She walked them around her cabin, pointing out the angles, the seams, the way the sod overlapped and interlocked. She explained the logic. The wind cannot penetrate packed earth. The earth holds temperature. 3 feet of sod is not just insulation. It is a barrier that the cold cannot break. She charged nothing. She claimed no credit. "I did not invent this," she told a farmer from Davison County who rode 15 miles to see her burming. "My grandmother knew it. Her grandmother knew it. I only remembered what we forgot when we crossed the ocean." 3 families in Minor County burned their cabins before the next winter. 7 families across 3 counties had done it by 1890. The technique was never written into agricultural bulletins or construction guides. It spread the old way through conversation, through observation, through the simple fact that earth-bermed cabins lost fewer children to the cold. Amos Cutter was seen in Howard's General Store in February 1888. When someone mentioned the Holm widow's survival, he said, "A lot of good luck does not make a good method. One storm proves nothing." He did not visit the Holm claim again. Ragna proved up her homestead in 1892, full title awarded 160 acres in her own name. She had paid her filing fees and proved her improvements and survived the required 5 years. Cutter's commission on resale was $0. Within 2 years of the schoolhouse blizzard, at least 11 families across southeastern Dakota Territory had banked sod against their timber walls. The method never received an official name. Settlers called it earth banking or sodding the walls, or simply what the Norwegian widow did. Ragna herself visited 3 families in the spring of 1889 to help them begin the work. She never accepted payment. When asked why, she said only, "I did not invent it. My grandmother knew it. Her grandmother knew it. I only remembered." Ragna Holm proved up her homestead claim in 1892 and received full title to her 160 acres. She never remarried. She raised her 3 children to adulthood on the claim she had nearly died to keep: Anders, Liv, and Britta, who walked with a slight limp for the rest of her life but kept all her toes. In 1901, Ragna purchased an additional 80 acres from a departing neighbor, paying cash she had saved over 13 years of farming. She was 52 years old when she died of pneumonia in 1911, still living in the cabin she had buried to survive her first Dakota winter. She was laid beside her husband Eric, 200 yards from the cabin door. On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped 86 degrees in 14 hours, and the wind chill reached 80 degrees below zero. Niels Bergstrom, who had survived 11 Dakota winters, had looked at Ragna Holm's thin-walled cabin and her 3 small children and told her, "A widow cannot heat a cabin alone. Your children will be ice before Christmas." He was wrong. The earth held. The walls did not shake. The fire burned small and steady through the longest night, and in the morning, when the wind finally stopped screaming, a woman who had never seen a Dakota winter walked out of a cabin half buried in sod and snow, her children alive behind her. The Berming stood for 23 years until the cabin was torn down in 1910. By then, Ragna no longer needed it. She had survived. The last thing the workers saw as the final wall came down was the packed earth falling away from the old board, still tight, still solid, still holding back the wind that never came again.